No one wanted this to happen. On March 19th, 2019, Osagi's father went to the State College Police Department to report his son missing. He'd last been seen at 8 p.m., and police were told that Mr. Osagi had a history of anxiety and schizophrenia and was probably off of his medication. Mr. Osagi's father was concerned that he would take his own life. Mr. Osagi had received a long text message that day from his son. In it, Mr. Osagi stated in part, there would be trouble with the police in a little bit, that his fast approaching deep sleep would result from a struggle between God and evil, the citizens of the U.S. and the government, and that any poor soul whose life he takes today, if any poor soul at all, then may God forgive their sins, if any. In a conversation that night with his father on the telephone, Mr. Osagi said he was going to die. Later that evening, he would text one of his caseworkers and said he would die very soon. At 2 o'clock, the officers, the detective called the Detective Bureau to confirm, one, that there was a 302 warrant, and two, to get the address of Mr. Osagi and confirm it. Radio traffic does confirm 3 minutes later that is when the call of shots fired went out. So you have to go down that half flight of stairs to the left to reach his apartment. That hallway is that hallway that you see at the bottom is 3 feet wide, and it's 7 feet long from the door to your right to Mr. Osagi's apartment door. When the officers went to knock on Mr. Osagi's door, officer number 1 stood in front of the door, and he actually put his thumb over the peephole. He did that because he didn't want to alert Mr. Osagi that the police were at his door and provoke a response. Officer number 2 was on that step, as you've seen now, watching what occurred, and officer number 3 was higher up. He could hear and see what the officers were doing and only see a partial view inside the apartment. The first officer knocked multiple times on the door. It took longer. What I'm going to describe to you right now, from the first knock on that door to the shots fired call, is 30 seconds or less. It'll take me a lot longer to explain, to walk through it second by second, so I want you to make you aware that probably the first 10 seconds we're waiting for Mr. Osagi to come to the door. The officers could hear someone moving inside the apartment and heard a voice eventually say that he was coming. The door opened out, and Mr. Osagi was standing in the doorway. Officer number 1 asked the person answering the door whether he was Mr. Osagi. Mr. Osagi answered yes. The officer asked Mr. Osagi if they could come in and talk to him. He responded no. As he was speaking to him, his right hand was up on the wall that you saw, out of sight. So the officer 1 and officer 2 had a full view of Mr. Osagi's body, but his hand was at shoulder height, up against the wall, and it was not visible. When Mr. Osagi said no, the officer said, well, would you come outside and talk to us? At that point in time, Mr. Osagi stepped backward, and the officer saw a serrated steak knife in his right hand. The knife was being held out at shoulder level with the blade pointed at officer number 1. At that moment, the officer drew his service revolver with his right hand and ordered Mr. Osagi to drop the knife multiple times. At the time that Mr. Osagi backed up, officer number 2 had a full view of his body and saw the knife in his right hand. Officer number 3, from halfway up the steps, could not see the knife, but could hear the reaction of the first officer screaming, drop the knife, and saw him moving backwards. In response to being told to drop the knife, Mr. Osagi said, shoot me, to which the officer responded, no, drop the knife. Officer number 1 began retreating backward to put distance between himself and Mr. Osagi. At that same time, the supervising detective told officer number 2 to get his taser, who was simultaneously already doing that. As officer number 2 was taking that taser out, upon either hearing the word taser or seeing it being taken out, Mr. Osagi moved to his right out of view and said, "No, I want to die." When Mr. Osagi disappeared from view, officer number 1 radioed, quote, "We need more units, we need more units." A second later, then the call of 1033, which is an emergency. Officer 1 backed up to the rear of that door that you saw, and at that point in time, Mr. Osagi came back into view. He was running out of his apartment with his knife in his right hand, pointed directly at officer number 1. When he made it to the doorway, the second officer discharged his taser. Officer number 2 could hear officer number 1 yell, "Stop." He described Mr. Osagi as running as fast as a person can run. Officer number 2 presumed the taser that it missed because he perceived no change in Mr. Osagi. He kept coming. Officer 2 actually saw officer number 1 back up behind him. So as you saw those steps, the second officer is on the first step, and officer number 1 has actually retreated past his vantage point. The first officer that Mr. Osagi was going to reach was the officer on the steps, officer number 2. Officer number 2 estimated he was 3 feet from Mr. Osagi when he discharged that taser. Forensic evidence confirmed that Mr. Osagi was in fact shot with the taser, and that taser was from a distance of approximately 3 feet. All 3 officers confirmed that officer number 1 retreated past officer number 2's position, that the taser was shot first, and that then there were gunshots. The second officer estimated that officer number 1 was 2 feet from Mr. Osagi when he started shooting. After shooting the taser, officer number 2 dropped it and was attempting to pull his gun, to access his gun, when the shots were fired. As Mr. Osagi came through that door and was shot with the taser, he canted or turned right towards officer number 2. And that is when the patrol officer started firing his weapon. Officer number 1 believed he shot 3 times, but physical evidence confirms that it was 4. The officer stopped firing when he saw that Mr. Osagi was falling. He saw the first shot strike Mr. Osagi on the left side. At the time that the officer shot, he estimated that his feet were 1 feet from Mr. Osagi, that he was falling backwards against the wall, and that his torso was 2 feet from Mr. Osagi. Gunshot residue and distance testing of the clothes of Mr. Osagi confirmed those officers' estimates. The actual distance from the muzzle to the garments was anywhere from 6 to 36 inches, or 1 to 2 feet as reported. At the time that officer number 1 was charged, he tells us the knife was raised up, pointed at him, at officer number 1 and 2, and he believes that had he not fired, he would have been seriously injured or killed. Officer number 2 indicated that but for officer number 1's quick actions, it was his opinion that either both or one of them would have been seriously injured or killed. Officer number 3 advised that from his perspective, the landing allowed no more room to retreat. The first officer had retreated as far back as he could, and he had no other option but to shoot. The officer's statements were compared with the objective evidence that the investigation put together. That evidence included 911 radio calls, evidence collected and documented at the scene by the Forensic Service Unit of the State Police, taser downloads, state crime lab reports, an autopsy, the pathologist who performed that autopsy's expert opinion on whether the physical evidence was consistent with the officer's statement and the reports that had been gathered, concluded that the autopsy's physical findings were consistent with officer number one's descriptions of the events that occurred, physical evidence recovered at the scene, and his medical examination. The events that I described, from the knock on the door to the call of shots fired, took 30 seconds. The events of seeing a knife to the time that shots were fired was 10 seconds. At the time that officer number one shot, there was no time to use any alternative means to stop a potentially deadly attack by Mr. Osagie. At the time of the incident, both officers acted consistently with their training and were justified in the use of their force. Justified in the use of the force of a taser and the use of deadly force given a deadly attack by Mr. Osagie.